Hello there, and a warm welcome to my Satyagraha short. This little video is designed to introduce a topic, a media item relating to this topic, and two theories to explain and analyse. I'll be talking to you about Gandhi's philosophy of non-violence in relation to the recent umbrella movement of Hong Kong. Let's get started. To understand Satyagraha was for me to understand the meaning behind a name. Gandhi recognised the importance of calling his philosophy something that reflected its values. He tried the terms passive resistance and civil disobedience, but they were not perfect. The campaign wasn't passive, and the ideals were not of disobedience. So the Sanskrit words satya, meaning truth, and agraha, meaning insistence of, or pursuit, was a perfect title, as Gandhi believed that life itself was the pursuit of truth. So, in a small Johannesburg theatre, on the 11th day of September 1906, Gandhi and his peers coined this non-violence concept. Truth and non-violence are inseparable, just like
peas and carrots.
That's right, just like peas and carrots. Forrest Gump does make a good analogy here. A modern example of this concept is the 2014 Occupy Central movement, which came to be known as the Umbrella Revolutions of Hong Kong. The strikes began on the 22nd of September, and the rallies and protests gained huge momentum, peaking around the 26th to the 28th. You may remember the trends hashtag Occupy Central, hashtag Occupy HK, and hashtag Umbrella Revolution, which circulated around social media. The movement began with students and was supported by the Occupy Central with Love and Peace Foundation, which was led by Hong Kong University law professor Benny Tai. 17-year-old Joshua Wong led Scholarism, and Alex Chow and Lester Shulm led the Hong Kong Federation of Students, both groups having similar aims to the Occupy group made famous via the Wall Street protests. When the students began to mobilise and occupy areas of Hong Kong, police fired pepper spray to disperse them. The umbrellas were used to repel the pepper spray and batons of police officers. Thus it quickly became a symbol of peaceful resistance. What was just a simple tool for getting out of the weather quickly became the symbol of the shield against corruption, lies, and that very nasty pepper spray. And here's the star of my show, the media item. This photograph by AP shows a young boy holding an umbrella for a police officer during the protests. Here the umbrella is used in a practical way, but I think that this image is saturated in symbolism. It embodies a good representation of both the movement and Gandhi's philosophy, so I will refer back to this as much as I can. One of the most prominent theorists, who himself worked with Gandhi in the early 1930s, is Richard Gregg, an American social philosopher, lawyer, and author of The Power of Nonviolence. The crux of his book is Gregg's metaphor of nonviolence as moral jiu-jitsu. Gregg believes nonviolent resistance acts as jiu-jitsu, as the nonviolence and goodwill of the victim act in the same way that the lack of physical opposition by the user of physical jiu-jitsu does, causing the attacker to lose his moral balance. The victim not only lets his attacker come out, but, as it were, he pulls him forward by kindness, generosity, and voluntary suffering. Thus, the non-violent actor, who understands the situation and context and has a greater purpose for his actions, keeps his moral balance intact. From this logic, the perpetrator is unbalanced, unsure, and the novelty of the situation and his ignorance of how to handle it means he is open to the values of the non-violent resistor. Let's take a look at how Gregg's jiu-jitsu concept measures up against my media item. Well, they certainly aren't in jiu-jitsu costumes, but there are clearly two sides here. One is dressed in uniform, the other in plain clothes, a poncho, a face mask, and that trusty umbrella. He isn't angry, his fists aren't clenched, and he's not ready to strike. In the pouring rain, he offers his symbol of injustice in its simplest form as a tool for keeping dry, to an officer there to actually send him home. It's an excellent shot, perfectly framed and timed with the officer looking up at the umbrella. I think this is the novelty of the situation as Gregg describes. Here is a young student offering his shelter to a superior force. We can assume the officer begins to question his own values for forcing these people with tear gas and beatings. The victim has let his attacker come and pulled the officer forward by kindness and generosity. This is a great representation of moral balance and the mentality of Satyagraha. As Greg affirms, the courage of the non-violent opponent is higher than the mere physical bravery or recklessness. Thus, our non-violent hero has what Greg and Gandhi before him described as a superior position. If you're still with me, I can tell you're eager to explore Satyagraha even further, and this time from a scholar who has more recently published conclusions. I'm going to refer to Michael Nagler's Non-Violence Handbook to get a contemporary viewpoint of the philosophy of non-violent action. Nagler parallels Greg's musings of non-violent action as beginning with oneself and the dedication needed to train in order to approach any conflict with the right intention. However, Nagler is also critical of Satyagraha and explains how non-violent approaches are not always successful. It is hard to argue against the pros of non-violent action, instead of war, as Nagler puts it, that leaves harm, bitterness and alienation. The activities of Satyagraha do good work in people's minds and hearts. But non-violent action can fail when training is not connected to appropriate methods of protest or support, or when the depth of non-violence being offered does not match the intensity of the violence. It looks to be an even match here. The presence of the officer displays a show of force by the Chinese authorities and Hong Kong Council, but he is not really forceful, brandishing his weapon or threatening of the protester. Similarly, the offering of the umbrella is clearly an act of goodwill that can only be the good work in the people's hearts and minds that Nagler described earlier. Nagler tells us that for a non-violent person, it's a success to simply stay non-violent even under great provocation. That was certainly shown by the unarmed, unthreatening resistance of the Hong Kong protesters against the baton and spray of the officials. Perhaps not quite shown here, but certainly in further media items that I will show later on. Nagler's discussion of symbols was particularly interesting for my media item, especially relevant as the umbrella came to be so easily recognised in relation to the Hong Kong protest. Nagler in fact attests that symbols are of limited use in Satyagraha. He uses the example of the tragedy of Tiananmen Square, Beijing, on June 4, 1989. Tiananmen Square is a symbol of disobedience and distraction, and photographs such as the iconic tank man are embedded in our memories. This was a pro-democracy protest that descended into chaos when Chinese troops violently claimed the square from the occupants, and thousands were killed. Despite the protests across the country, Tiananmen would stand as the symbol of those 1989 protests. I tend to disagree with Nagler here. In a world of huge communication and violent disruption, the symbol of the umbrella created a lasting point of awareness and understanding for the global media to recognise. I myself recognise these protests not because of the non-violent actions or because of the demands of the protesters, but from the umbrella as a symbol for resistance. Here is a $5 object that you never seem to have when it starts pouring, up against the might of a police force, helmets, batons, poisonous substances and shields. If you look at the media item, the umbrella is framing the shot. It draws the eye from protester to policeman. The title of the accompanying article detailed the umbrella revolution, and the streets surrounding this young man were littered with drawings of umbrellas, posters, and the umbrellas themselves. In this case, a symbol was beneficial to the awareness and active resistance of Satyagraha in Hong Kong.
I think overnight that umbrella from being a household item suddenly transformed into a symbol of defiance and solidarity.
Well, that was intense. Time to sum up the concept of Satyagraha and its relevance to my media item. Gandhi's Satyagraha is a philosophy of truth and peaceful resistance that dates back to the early 1900s. Satya is meaning of truth and agraha means either pursuit of or insistence of. A contemporary example of this movement is the Hong Kong pro-democracy protests of September 2014. Labelled as the Umbrella Revolution, students and working-class citizens occupied central and major business districts of Hong Kong to deliver a message to China. This was a pursuit of truth, acted out using a non-violence approach, as shown in my chosen media item. Looking at the theories presented by Gregg and Nagler, the Umbrella Revolution was a defining example of Satyagraha's principles during a time where violence was predicted on a large scale. Thank you so much for surviving to the very end of my short. If you have any questions or would like to post a comment to help improve my short, I'd be greatly appreciative.